Three things make this election more tense than most: the deep political divide, that surge in COVID-19 cases Jeff mentioned, and the social unrest that was sparked after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His death at the hands of police fired up the Black Lives Matter movement all over the world, and it is mobilizing many voters in this election. Heather Yourex-West is in the city where George Floyd lived.
H.P. Rogers has only been a photographer for 6 months. After the death of George Floyd here in May, he was inspired to capture everything that happened next.
After taking that photo, my eyes were burning, my nose was burning. And to see people stand in that for as long as they did, just like shows the amount of passion and dedication people have for what they're out here for.
He believes that passion and dedication will now be carried to the polls.
4 years ago, voter turnout among African Americans dropped significantly right across the country. This time around, that's expected to change, particularly here in Minnesota.
This is an election of a lifetime. You know, we hear that cliche bandied about in every election, but this is, in my 42 years of life, the most important that I think I'll ever be a part of.
Jamar Nelson has spent months campaigning for the Democrats. He says he's excited to cast his ballot in person Tuesday, and this year he'll have his son by his side. Jamar Jr. turns 18 Monday, right before Election Day.
I want to have a change in the black community so everything could be different and not everything would be the same anymore.
But with excitement comes anxiety. 4 years ago, Lewis Hunter's cousin Philando Castile was fatally shot by a police officer during a traffic stop in St. Paul. The restaurant owner plans to vote for Joe Biden, but worries for his city should the election go the other way.
I don't know. I can't even imagine, because it's scary. I'm hoping for peace, even if it happens.
Back in the neighborhood where George Floyd died, Butchie Austin sees things differently.
I really believe what happened here in May is it was a moral issue. It really had nothing to do with your partisan alignment.
Does he plan to vote? Absolutely. But he says he knows the struggle for racial justice will continue long after Election Day. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Minneapolis.
There is unease about what could happen in the hours and days after the election, especially if President Trump prematurely claims victory before a result is clear. Oregon's governor has put the National Guard on standby in Portland. There were mass demonstrations and riots there when Trump won in 2016, and it's been a flashpoint this year in response to racial injustice. Global's Farah MacDonald is in Portland tonight.
As the world watched the mayhem unfolding on the streets of Portland, Oregonians on the ground had no choice but to be consumed by it.
I've lived in different corners of the country, and the racism here is so insidious, but it is definitely everywhere.
For Ty Carpenter, who heads the group Don't Shoot Portland, and the city itself, the violent protests were unprecedented, but the racial injustice that galvanized citizens is nothing new.
The past couple of years of fear-mongering and racial tensions building, it's been even worse in recent weeks. You know, there's a lot of hate crimes that happen here in Portland, Oregon. There's a very strong presence of far-right extremists.
The movement also inspired allies like Baker Carey-Padian to take action and take heat for it, taking a public stance in support of demonstrators' demands to defund the police. The response from critics was swift and fierce.
Obviously, it hit a sore point. And that was important to us to sort of keep going.
But Black Americans like Carl Jefferson say the protests don't speak for him.
I believe that things should be done in a more orderly fashion. And it affected me in a way that it's disheartening that I didn't know my country would delve to this level.
Marcus Gabriel Jr. lives and works in red-swinging suburbia.
It's really brought to light certain people's opinions and feelings that I didn't realize that they had.
Once the ballots are cast and the polls are closed, partisanship is expected to boil over in Portland once again, with state officials taking a preemptive strike on Monday to simmer growing tensions.
We know that there are some people who might want to use peaceful election night protests to promote violence and property destruction.
With clashes expected in some capacity, even law enforcement officials are growing uneasy. One officer based in Portland told us off camera he fears for his safety and that of his family in the current political climate. Donna.
All right, Sarah MacDonald in Portland, Oregon, thanks. There's no question the U.S. is facing a stark choice in this election. Deciding who to vote for is always driven in part by what's affecting individual voters' lives. And in this election, for many Americans, issues of race are top of mind, as Farah Nasser explains.
Fist up! Fight! Fist up!
The killing of George Floyd in May unleashed a wave of anger and resentment about the treatment of African Americans and other people of color at the hands of police, and about a president who is being, at best, tone deaf on these issues.
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
And at worst, has openly encouraged white supremacist groups. People say Donald Trump is a president unlike any other, and that's true. But Trump is not an aberration of history. Rather, he is a product of American history and of a democracy that has become more partisan and more polarized with each passing year. Republicans and Democrats have always had different views, but the gap between them has never been as wide as it is now.
This is the memorial to Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower. In the 50s, he had an 88% approval rating among party faithful. Remarkably, nearly half of all Democrats approved of him as well. Now, you could chalk that up to the fact that the economy was booming in the post-war era, but then take a look at this.
In 1956, Eisenhower got almost 40% of the African American vote. But by the 1960s, following the passage of the Civil Rights Act by Democrat Lyndon Johnson, that support had plummeted to just 6%. Under Nixon, Republicans used the so-called Southern strategy, veiled racist messaging, to attract disgruntled white voters in the South. The seeds of Trumpism were planted decades ago, and it's over race where the divisions are the most clear. Before 1964, African American voters were distributed among the two parties. But over time, a gap developed as non-white voters steadily and dramatically shifted to the Democratic Party.
Today, those divisions are most striking in the Rust Belt areas to the north, where white rural voters, some of them lifelong Democrats, came out in droves in 2016 and gave President Trump the White House. And that's why Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania will be key battlegrounds this election. Farah Nasser, Global News, Washington.